Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the second of the recordings about the Gilded Age. In our last section, what we talked about was some of the issues with movement, migration into central and western states, some of the consequences of that for the economies of those areas, whether it's mining or farming or ranching and that kind of thing. Also talked about the impact that this has on Native Americans, right? Because this land was not empty, just waiting for white people to show up and put down roots and begin from scratch. This was land that had been claimed for hundreds and thousands of years by people who had established a very, very significant connection with that land and developed cultures and traditions that that spoke to them in that way. Pardon me. Well, in the late 1800s, part of the overall experience of the United States was a dramatic growth in the population of the country. And we talked about the movement of people into new parts of the country, but part of the reason for that was the growth of the population along the eastern coast especially. So you have literally millions of people arriving in the United States between 1870 and, say, 1920 or so. And lots of them are going to end up staying, for a variety of reasons, in cities along the East Coast. So Boston, Philadelphia, especially New York City. Some will move into industrial cities in the Midwest, places like Pittsburgh or Detroit or Cleveland or Chicago or Milwaukee. But this is a period of immigration that's a little bit different from anything that the country had experienced before. There had been waves of immigration into the United States at different times. 1830s and 1840s, we see large numbers of people, especially coming from Ireland, because of a famine, a potato blight that kills off large amounts of the potato crop in Ireland. 1860s into the 1870s, we see large numbers of German and Scandinavian immigrants. In the 1880s, 90s, 1900s, 1910s, this is when we see a lot of people moving to the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe. So places like Italy, Spain, Greece, Russia, Poland, the Ukraine. And so these are people that have very, very different kinds of religious beliefs, very different kinds of languages, very different kinds of food and clothing cultures. And this is going to contribute to a great deal of tension, and as we'll see, a lot of discontent among white Americans, in some cases even the descendants of recent immigrants themselves, who have problems with this generation of immigrants arriving in the country. So there's tension between immigrants and the people of the city itself, right? There are also then tensions within immigrant populations themselves, right? So older generations of immigrant families sometimes are more committed to holding on to their traditions and their cultures. They say, well, we left Poland because we wanted to have political freedom, economic freedom. We didn't leave Poland because we wanted to stop being Polish. Right? We didn't leave Poland because we wanted to stop being a Polish Jew. We left Poland for political reasons or for economic reasons or that sort of thing. There are then the younger generations who oftentimes say, look, in order to fit in with the people that we live near, we need to become more American, right? We need to speak English, we need to change the way we dress, we need to change some of the foods that we eat, so on and so forth. And so there's a great deal of tension, not just between the immigrant population and the people of the cities that were already living there, but there's also tension and disagreement that exists within the families themselves. White America is not too excited about the prospect of having more and more people coming into the country, especially people who do not share the quote-unquote proper kinds of traditions and cultures that have come to define American life. And so there are efforts at restricting immigration. In 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which essentially shuts off all Chinese immigration into the country. It says, once and for all, nobody will be allowed into the country. Those are the formal kinds of limits that are created. There are also informal limits, and these are sort of backroom negotiations and agreements between diplomats of different countries, where a diplomat from the United States might speak to a diplomat from Russia and say, you know what, Sergei, we would really like it if you could stop Russians from coming into the United States. We don't like having Russians come into the country. And Sergei will say, well, you know, there's only so much I can do. I might be able to find some way to help out, but what can you do for me? And so the American diplomat will say, well, you know, we have a surplus of X amount of wheat that we won't be able to get rid of, so how about you try to limit the ability for Russians to come to the United States, and in exchange, we will give you some of this surplus wheat. So this is something that is not being voted on by Congress. This is not something that is an actual formal written down approval or agreement. It's just a wink and a handshake, and all of a sudden the Americans get a limit on the amount of people from a particular part of the world that can come into the country. So those are a couple of the sort of ways in which immigration is restricted during this time period. We'll talk about this again when we get into the 1920s. But part of the idea of limiting immigration comes from very racist kinds of concerns about genetic mixing, right? So part of it is you have bigots and racists who say, well, I don't want people from such and such a place coming into this country because they're going to start having children with white people, and so the purity of basically white superiority will begin to get diluted and watered down, right? That is a fairly common explanation or justification for reasons to limit immigration into the country. There is also a very common explanation that is, well, immigrants are coming into the country and they're taking jobs from poor whites. Poor whites shouldn't have to face unfair competition with people who will come into the country and don't know any better, and so will be willing to work for less money. And so this is also part of that process. As we will see when we get into the progressive era, there is also an aspect of immigration reform, which is sort of a euphemistic way of talking about it, immigration restriction, that comes from the role of political machines. Now, political machines, it doesn't have anything to do with actual machinery. Political machine is the term for a political entity that sort of takes advantage of certain conditions in the American political arena to benefit itself. In other words, you have bosses in major cities around the country, especially along the East Coast, who will make promises to potential voters in exchange for their votes. And this isn't just, you know, a presidential candidate that says, if you vote for me, I'll make the economy better, right? This is, if you vote for me, I can guarantee you that I will give you a job at such and such a factory, because they have made those arrangements with the factory owner to say, hey, you know, I know you need some people to work making watches in your factory. How about I can guarantee you 300 people working for 20 cents less every day than the people that you've got working there now. So the factory owner will say, that's great. I'll give you $5,000 towards your campaign, and the political candidate will go into the neighborhood and say, if you vote for me, I will give you a job at this person's watch factory because I've already made those arrangements. So this is patronage. This is what's called the spoils system. It is a very quid pro quo version of politics. And this can be done because up into the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, most voting was not secret. So you would go into the polling place and you would announce exactly who you were voting for which candidate, for which position. And so it was very obvious whether you had followed through on your end of the bargain, so the candidate would or wouldn't then follow through with giving you that job or connecting you with that job. So part of the desire to limit immigration also derives from this idea that, well, we need to limit the number of people who will come into the country that political bosses and machine politicians will be able to exploit in this way. So machine politics, hugely important part of American political life at the turn of the century, especially in cities. And city life is going to take a dramatic turn during the Gilded Age. The rapid growth of the population means that cities in the United States will become much more modern in terms of their look, in terms of the kinds of services that they provide, in terms of the density and diversity of the population. Having larger and larger numbers of people living in a fairly small amount of space means that you have a need for an urban planning system, right? Somebody to step in and say, well, we should make sure that these roads are laid out in a very efficient pattern so that people can get from place to place, so that public transportation systems can be established that can move people in large numbers so that the streets are going to be less crowded and less clogged. We're going to put in parks to provide green space so that people aren't going to be surrounded by concrete and glass and steel all the time. The Gilded Age also is the period of the introduction of the skyscraper, which is a building style that will allow for way more people and way more commercial use in a much smaller footprint. So if you live in a 40-story apartment building, you might live in that space with 500 other people or more. To have 500 individual homes, or even 250 or 100 homes, depending on the number of people living in the family, you would be talking about a much larger amount of land that has to be developed in order to house all of those people. Same thing with commercial space, right? Belden Village Mall, or any mall of any size, requires a large footprint in order to actually house all of the retail establishments. If you would stack those establishments one on top of another, you're going to be able to squeeze way more into a much smaller area. The Chicago Fire of 1871 is one of the events that helps encourage the development of these kinds of city plans, encourage the use of skyscrapers as a major change in the way that populations and business are distributed in cities. Early suburbs will start to emerge because the poor, whether they're immigrants or just the urban poor, end up being confined into the center of cities more often. And so people with the money and the ability to do so will end up settling around the edges of those cities. They're going to be serviced by early rail systems, commuter rail systems, that will allow people to move from their homes in the suburbs into the city to do their work and then leave. because they don't want to live in the area where the urban poor are living. And so you see the gradual separation of populations based on socioeconomics. In those inner cities, tenements, which are large, very cheaply built and poorly designed apartment buildings, tenements will house, in some cases, hundreds of people in very cramped quarters. The picture there on the right is from the book How the Other Half Lives. It's written by a man named Jacob Riis in 1890, and he's basically trying to kind of shine a light on overcrowding and poor sanitation and poverty in urban areas, especially New York City. And in the picture, if you look closely, you can see this is literally the one room where people will live. This is living room, kitchen, bedroom, everything. There will be a shared bathroom down the hall, sometimes with hot water, sometimes without. And there's something like 9 people living in that one space. And you can count them in the image, between 7 and 9 people. And this wasn't uncommon. Sometimes it would be an entire family, sometimes these would be strangers, sometimes it would be a combination of the two. Disease is a serious problem. Fire is a serious threat because people are squeezed in such cramped quarters that disease spreads very, very quickly. The stove on the left-hand side is used for cooking, it's used for heating water, for bathing, it's used for drying clothing, it's used for heating water for laundry, it's used for storage, right? And the building itself is not terribly fire resistant. There are no fire codes that will provide for sprinklers or escape systems or any kind of protection for residents of these tenements. And so many people in these cities live in conditions like this. Really squalid, very, very unpleasant, unsanitary, unhealthy, dangerous kinds of conditions. Economically speaking, the emergence of large immigrant populations is going to contribute, at least a little bit, to changes in American business in the late 1800s. So the country undergoes a transition towards a very heavily industrialized economy. Partially, this is because of the growth of population, because a growing population, on the one hand, means you have a lot of people who can work in factories and work in the industry itself, but at the same time, because of the nature of a capitalist system, a large population also means that you have more people available to buy the stuff that is being made, because it doesn't matter how much stuff you make if you don't have people who will buy it. And so a growing population means that you have workers and consumers, right? Both ends of the sort of capitalist equation are being filled. The United States also benefits from having a wide variety of abundant raw materials, right? So not every place in the world has all the things that they need in order to power heavy industry. Japan is a good example, right? Japan, for a while, has been a manufacturing center of one type or another, but they also have to import certain things in order to power that industry, because they don't have a lot of iron, they don't have a lot of coal, so it's not as though they're making their own steel. They have to import steel from other parts of the world in order to power their economy, to make their own cars or to make their own ships or trains or what have you. Well, at this time then, we see a significant growth in the number of corporations or businesses that try to control the marketplace, right? Monopolies. And there are 2 different types of monopoly. 3 if you count the awesome board game, but 2 historically for our purposes. Monopoly is one of my favorite games ever. It's awesome. But in terms of actual history, which is what you're all here for, There are two types of monopoly. One is what's known as vertical integration. The other is horizontal integration. With vertical integration, this is when a company buys up all of the different steps in the process of whatever that industry is. In other words, a good example would be Carnegie Steel. Andrew Carnegie is a Scottish immigrant. He creates Carnegie Steel in the 1860s, 1870s, and by the time he sells his control of that company, he is the richest man in the world. Basically, Carnegie Steel's version of vertical integration is steel is not a natural substance, right? You can't just go out into the world and find a steel mine and dig up steel and then turn it into, building girders or something like that. Steel is an alloy. You combine different things, primarily iron, to make steel. So you need iron, you need coal to heat the iron to the point that you can start adding the things that you need to and burning off the impurities that you need to in order to make steel. So Carnegie realized, if I am buying iron ore, and if I am buying coal, and if I am paying somebody to transport that stuff on the railroad to get it to my steel mills, I have to pay all of these people more money than the cost of that item itself. Because somebody that runs an iron mine is running that iron mine for profit. And so he is selling that iron for more money than it costs him to actually mine the iron. Well, Carnegie says, if I buy my own iron mine, then all I have to do is pay my workers to get the iron out. And then I just have to pay the amount of money that it would take to transport that iron to my mills in Pittsburgh. And so vertical integration is, well, yeah, I own my steel mills, but instead of having to buy the iron, instead of having to buy the coal, instead of having to pay some railroad company to transport all of that stuff to me, I will buy my own iron mine. I will buy my own coal mine. I will build my own railroads. That way, I am just paying the cost of all of those things. I'm not paying a profit margin on top of that. Standard Oil does the same thing. Standard Oil originally is just a refining process that turns raw petroleum into initially heating oil, but then eventually into gasoline and into kerosene and those kinds of things. Standard Oil says, well, why don't I build my own barrel factory, right? Make my own barrels so I'm not paying somebody to buy barrels that I then use to transport the oil or the kerosene. Why don't I build my own pipelines? Why don't I have my own retail establishments where I sell my own stuff? And so that's vertical integration. You are controlling all aspects of your particular business operation. Horizontal integration is if you eliminate your competition. So banks do this a lot, right? Banks will buy up other banks and then take them over, or gut them and take their sort of value, take their infrastructure. So horizontal integration is you are gobbling up all of the different companies that might be competitors to you. So you can have companies that do both, right? Standard Oil buys up other oil companies to eliminate them. But they are limiting competition in different ways. And we'll talk about the antitrust movement when we get into the progressive era, right? Because that's going to be a different direction of this whole conversation, which we'll get to in a different section. But these monopolies are the kinds of things that antitrust efforts are directed towards. At the same time, one of the other things that profoundly transforms the American workplace is during the Gilded Age, there is a growth in union efforts. Okay, sorry about the abrupt pause there. There was a spasm of different noises, including my cat getting sick. So I had to... I didn't think anybody wanted to hear that any more than necessary. But so one of the things that's taking place economically around this time, and also in some ways kind of connected with the emergence of large numbers of immigrants into the American economy, is the growth of labor unions. The economic system at the end of the 19th century is very much a boom or bust kind of situation. In other words, when things are going well, they're going very, very well. When things aren't going well, they are catastrophically bad. And so the organization of labor unions is partially a result of the desire among workers to try to find some kind of job security, some kind of leverage that they can use, partially to make their working conditions better, but also partially to try to ensure as much as possible that they will not be easily replaced. Having large numbers of unskilled jobs and large numbers of unskilled laborers means that if I'm working in a factory somewhere and I get injured, or I show up late one day, or the boss just doesn't like me, I can be fired without any kind of consequence whatsoever. So early labor unions tended to be former kind of fraternal organizations, right? Groups of people from similar backgrounds, or people who wanted to have time to sit around the bar and play pool and drink beer. And gradually they start to congeal into, hey, we all work in the same factory, we all work in the same industry, we all have the same kinds of concerns or problems. Maybe we could organize ourselves to try to leverage our numbers in our own favor. One of the earliest of these is known as the Knights of Labor, and the Knights of Labor is created in 1861 by a guy named Uriah Stevens. Early labor leaders have really great names. Uriah Stevens organizes this Knights of Labor union, but he is fairly inclusive, right? Basically, the membership of the Knights of Labor could be open to all who toiled, and that's literally the word that they used. Basically, anybody that worked for a living. They said, if you're a banker, you don't work for a living. You make money off of money. You're a gambler, you're not working for a living, right? If you're a liquor dealer, you're not working, you're peddling a vice. So the Knights of Labor say, we want an 8-hour workday, because at the time there's no restriction, there's no limitation on how long an employer can keep you working. And we want an end to child labor, because at the time, people as young as 6 or 7 years old could be working in factories or mills or that kind of thing. So the Knights of Labor is pushing for fairly common kinds of reforms, but the local chapters are uncoordinated, they're not really unified, they don't work together towards the same goals at the same times. And so ultimately, by 1900, the Knights of Labor has really kind of evaporated as a major labor movement. They haven't achieved really any of their stated goals, but they have gotten the ball rolling. And the union that really sort of pushes American labor organization in a new direction is called the American Federation of Labor. And it's initially run by a man named Samuel Gompers. The reason that the AFL is so much more influential, and the AFL still exists today in sort of a version of its original self, the reason the AFL is more influential and more successful is because it's a combination of smaller unions, right, kind of a conglomeration of smaller unions, But those unions are all made up of skilled workers, craftsmen. Well, why is this more advantageous? Well, it's more advantageous because if I am pulling a lever in a mill and all I do is stand at that lever all day long, just pulling it hundreds or thousands of times, I can be easily replaced, right? If I get injured or for one reason or another, if I'm not working that day, management can go out onto the street corner and find somebody and say, hey, buddy, do you want to come in and pull this lever all day and we'll pay you for it? No training needed, no skill needed. If I am a carpenter, if I'm a mason or a bricklayer or an electrician, you can't just go onto the street and find somebody to do my job. I am a skilled worker. I have some sort of a craft, a trade. And so that means that if I decide not to work, because that's really the leverage that a union has, right, is to refuse to do the work, go on strike. If I refuse, I have way more leverage because if I stop working, and if all my other electrician colleagues stop working as well, if my whole union goes on strike, management cannot easily replace us. They're not just going to go to the local tavern and say, hey, does anybody want to thread the electrical wires in my building? So the AFL has a lot more leverage that it can use in order to push for these different kinds of changes, right? Whether these are changes in working hours, wages, working conditions, so on. So it's created in 1881. In 1886, they basically give Congress an ultimatum. They say, we will all go on strike on May 1st, 1886, if you do not pass a law that makes the limit of a workday 8 hours. Congress doesn't do that. As a result, there is a demonstration a few days later among all of the things that are happening around the country. One of them is a demonstration in Chicago at a place called Haymarket Square. There's a strike by workers at a company that makes farm implements, the McCormick Harvester Company. There's a strike there that the AFL supports, right? So these are not all AFL members. These are people in some cases who are just workers at the McCormick Company, and the AFL says, you know what, we're going to throw our weight behind your efforts. And one thing leads to another during the night of May 4th. There is a bomb that goes off. Some police officers are killed, some are injured, some demonstrators are killed, some are injured. Immediately after the bomb goes off, police fire into the crowd, killing and wounding how many more? Anarchists were the kind of whipping boy of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Any political philosophy that didn't align with capitalist democracy was seen as violent and dangerous. Yes, lots of anarchists were violent and dangerous, but anarchism as an ideology doesn't necessarily equal violence. But pretty much immediately, the Chicago police blame anarchists, accuse anarchists, arrest multiple sort of figures within the Chicago anarchist population, community. And even though there was virtually no real proof, they kind of railroad a number of people through a trial and directly towards execution. The press coverage really solidifies in a lot of Americans' minds the idea that labor organization of any type was naturally violent and naturally anarchistic, naturally anathema to traditional American values, right? Even though that wasn't always the case. it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it was a matter that, well, if the media tells you that this is the case, then that's the case. And so labor organization doesn't get a lot of traction really all the way into the 1930s, because there are still a lot of Americans that believe that labor and labor organizations and labor unions are problematic, let's say, whether they're violent, whether they're undermining the idea of capitalist democracy, you name it. And so there were a couple of different incidents during the late 1800s. We'll just focus on two, right? Haymarket, and we'll talk about Pullman. These are certainly not the only ones. You have violence at the Homestead steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania. You have violence in mines, coal mines and iron mines, etc., in different parts of the country. The Pullman strike is in what's known as a company town. Pullman, Illinois, was a city basically built from the ground up by the Pullman Sleeping Car Corporation. So this is a railroad car where people can sleep so that they're traveling long distance across the country. And it's a car with beds and toilet facilities and that kind of thing. So George Pullman makes a lot of money off of this, builds his own town. And the town is designed so that the workers at the Pullman factory will live in the town. The town will provide all the things that they will need. It'll have its own church, it'll have its own housing, it'll have its own meeting halls, rec center, eventually its own theater, all of this. But the problem is people that work for the Pullman Company will not get paid in money. They will get paid in scrip, S-C-R-I-P. Basically, this is like funny money that can only be used inside the company town. And so the company town stores can charge whatever they want because there's no competition. I can't take my scrip into Chicago, which is near Pullman, and try to spend it in a local grocery store or general store because scrip won't spend. So the Pullman workers go on strike, which wouldn't really be all that bad, but there is a sympathy strike by the American Rail Union. And these are the people that actually make the railroads run, right? These are the people that actually power the trains that carry people and goods and the mail, etc., all around the country. So this is a much more paralyzing kind of a strike than anything that the Pullman employees would be able to do. In July of 1894, the president, Grover Cleveland, decides to mobilize the army because the governor of Illinois is refusing to step in and break this strike. President Cleveland says this is a violation, this is a danger to national security, plus you're interfering with the delivery of the U.S. mail. So this makes it a federal issue. Ultimately, between the arrival of the U.S. Army and the fact that replacement workers were so easy to find, the strike fails. And this is a fairly common kind of a thing, because as I said, because you have such a boom and bust economy, and because you have millions of people who are out of work and looking for work, it's pretty easy to find replacement labor. So the amount of power that a striking population or a group of strikers has is really pretty nullified because of the existence of large numbers of people who are available to take those jobs. But this is all part of this process of tension between sort of the old and the new. And this is a lot of what's going on all the way up into the 1920s and into the 1930s. And so we'll see that kind of overarching thread throughout this whole period. I mentioned at the start of the Gilded Age stuff that this is a time when we can see the genesis of a lot of things that we take for granted in America today. And one of the ways we can see that is in consumer and leisure society, right? So today, it's very common, it's very easy for us to go shopping. It's very easy for us to, well, I mean, in normal circumstances, it's very easy for us to go to a sporting event or go to the movies or go to an amusement park. Those are all things that come into existence during the Gilded Age. You have more people with more money, disposable income, right? Money that is not immediately earmarked for rent or for food or for utility payments or that kind of thing. Money that can be used for, you know what? I need a new X, or I want to go do Y. This is also the time when manufacturing is mechanized. So goods, clothing, furniture, appliances are being invented and mass-produced. So instead of somebody needing a new suit and going to the local tailor and saying, I need you to make me a suit, if you need a new suit, you would go to the local department store and buy a suit. There's mail order catalogs, right? The equivalent of today's Amazon, where you would have the Sears and Roebuck catalog, which would have practically anything you can imagine from A to Z, all the way from hat pins to houses, right? Literally. You could buy guns, you could buy pipe organs, you could buy carriages, you could buy collars for your shirts, you could buy drugs, anything that you can imagine, all the way up to, by the 19-teens and 20s, up to and including entire houses. They would deliver the house to you in kit form, and you would just build it. So, mail order that provides you with the ability to acquire all kinds of things, and prices that are low enough that you can acquire more than one of a thing. So instead of having one pair of shoes for Sunday service and one pair of shoes for everything else, now you can have different shoes for different occasions. You can go to a department store where shopping is an event, an activity, something almost to the level of going to the theater and showing off, wearing your best outfits and browsing, right? Rather than just buying something particular that you need and then going home, shopping becomes an activity. You also have more free time, and you have, comparatively speaking, more disposable income to do leisure kinds of activities. So rather than going to work, working for 12 or 14 hours a day, going home and eating and sleeping and getting up and doing it all over again, increasingly mechanization will allow for more free time. Plus, as the electric light starts to be implemented more regularly, you can have third shifts, right? You can have people working at night, which will help spread out the workload. And so people have money that they can devote to going to sporting events. People have money that they can devote to reading dime novels, right? Mass-produced, cheap publications like that. Early motion pictures. Initially not things that are really all that much plot-oriented or character-oriented. They're just kind of things to stand and look at. Gradually, by the sort of turn of the century into the 19-teens, you have the construction of theaters, right? Movie palaces where people can go in groups and watch movies. That wasn't really the way that motion pictures were viewed initially, but over time they kind of become those kinds of communal activities. Early amusement parks. Cedar Point is constructed in the 1870s as part of this whole kind of surge of leisure activity. Coney Island, which today is just a shadow of its former self. Coney Island is kind of the mecca of American amusement parks. It's actually broken down into 3 different sections. The 2 most significant, the 2 most popular are Dreamland and Luna Park. Dreamland was built around the idea that you would go into this huge space and there would be representations of all kinds of different legendary or mythical or literary scenes, whether it was heaven and hell, or whether it was things from the Bible, or whether it was things from fairy tales or from American legends or that sort of thing. So that was Dreamland. Luna Park was centered around the idea of the electric light, right, which was still a really fascinating novelty for a lot of people. And Luna Park was built around something like 250,000 to 300,000. Sorry about that. I don't know what that was. But in any event, Luna Park, which is the top right image, was, again, built around the idea that people wanted to experience the electric light in all of its glory, right? And so you would walk through these brightly lit kinds of spaces, and especially at night, obviously, then it's going to be a really dramatic kind of an experience. But so the Gilded Age, in a lot of ways, it's really a matter of introducing Americans to new technologies, to new concepts, to new kinds of things that are going to dramatically transform the America that people take for granted, right? And as I said, it very much is, in a lot of ways, pointing in the direction of the America that we live in today. If we would go back in time, say to 1905, it would be much more recognizable than if we went back in time to, say, 1850. And a lot of that is a result of changes that are taking place during the Gilded Age. So that's where we'll pause here. We will get into the next section, which is American expansionism and American imperialism. So I hope everybody is doing really well. Let me know if you've got questions about anything. I'll be happy to help out with that. And I will see people shortly then.